Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Ring. Welcome to another edition of FAMM's Heart to Heart series. Today we're going to talk about the question, are prisons torture? And that provocative title is getting at an idea that FAMM has been trying to pass independent oversight at prisons around the country because we think most people don't realize what is going on inside our nation's prisons and jails because they are kept from public view. They're usually kept from the media's view. And so people don't know. And honestly, some of us who work in the space have a concern that even when they know, they don't care. And so we have to do a better job of making them care. And so we have to talk more about what's going on. I think there's also a sense that we don't want to do things to improve conditions because we're anti-prison, so we don't want to make things better. And that's a short-sighted view that leaves people in prison really unsafe. And so I want to talk about that as well. And we have great people to talk to about that. I'm sorry to say that Dr. Amit Dominic from the Texas Prison Air Conditioning Advocacy Association isn't going to be able to join. We have technical difficulties, but we have Carrie Blakinger from the Marshall Project and Jessica Sandoval from ACLU's. You're the head of the Unlock the Box. Is that the name of the program? Okay, you have to unmute yourself. So I just want to jump in, and when I think of torture, and it's in the news a lot right now, I do think of solitary confinement. There was just an op-ed from a gentleman who just served 16 years in solitary confinement. So Jessica, let's start, maybe give us just some background on the use of solitary, how often it's used, why this even exists, and then we'll talk in more detail. But thank you for coming.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I think the question about solitary, it started as a form of solitude. The Quakers decided it would be a good idea to give people the opportunity to take some peace and quiet out to reflect. And what they found out was this doesn't work very well. And so it was pretty much put aside for a long time, through the 70s, in fact. And it wasn't really till the 80s when we saw a boom with the drug war and prison building that we saw solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is essentially, 22 or more hours a day in a small cell, usually 6x9, with, a window or not, with a cellmate or not. But most likely it's a very restrictive setting. So there's, not access to recreation, books, mail, canteen, and other, sometimes even visitation is cut off. So it's a very restrictive form of isolation, and it's used widely across the United States in jails, prisons, immigration, detention centers, and juvenile facilities as well.
Sorry, I was muted. Sometimes you hear people talk about the SHU, which is segregated housing. Do you make a distinction when somebody is in a two-person cell versus when they are in solitary confinement, or do you see them the same, or is there a difference?
We believe they're the same because you don't get a choice of who your cellmate is. And if you're in, a small cell locked in a box with somebody for, 20 plus hours a day, and it's not somebody you want to be there with, it does make it a form of torture in and of itself.
Yeah, I tell people I spent a year and a half in prison, and I'm the weakest person. Like I'm not. I was not strong. I was at a federal prison camp, and I used to say I'm camp material. Like I couldn't have done a medium or high security. I'm a wimp. And we had a scabies outbreak, and so to sort of address that, they put us in solitary. So I spent 2 days, like 40 hours in solitary, and I thought I was going to go crazy. And I wouldn't have known that. And so at the camp, solitary was used as punishment, right? Like if people violated the rules in the camp, they'd be sent, and they'd spend, a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, and sometimes with somebody, some with not. But we were alone because they were trying to keep us. And I didn't have paper or pencil. The book cart hadn't come around. That was Thursdays. And even though we were there for health reasons, they treated us as if we were there for disciplinary reasons. What happens to people when they are alone that long? Because like I said, I was ready to climb the walls. We just had a window so I could basically tell what time of day it was, but there was no clock or anything. It was so disorienting, and I can't even imagine spending a week, let alone a month or a year. What happens to people? Like, what does the research say that happens?
Yeah, the research and all the people who I've ever spoken to about solitary confinement, it's a range. It's psychological, it's physiological. A lot of people describe it being very physically painful. A lot of self-harm happens. Then, psychologically, there's a range of things that happen, from anxiety, panic attacks, like you said, disorientation, hallucinations, into real full-blown kind of mental health acute crisis happens, many times. And sometimes it's irreparable. And beyond 15 days, that is why we think it's very harmful and very painful existence.
Yeah, we'll talk more about solitary. I want to talk about other ways that prison is suboptimal for human beings. Carrie, you've written a lot about the subject of healthcare, in particular teeth. And I, for some reason, when I came out and I was telling people my experience, the thing they always thought was so interesting was when you did an initial screen, they said, "Oh, you had a cavity." I had a cavity. I thought I had got checked before I went, but they said you had a cavity, and you'll have to get a filling. Just put in a cop out, and we'll do it. And then I got back to my my cellmates, and I was just like, "Oh yeah, I got to put a cop out, to get a tooth filled." And they were all like, "Are you kidding?" You're like, they were laughing, but they're like, "It's a 2-year waiting list." And I thought, "Oh my goodness!" And then I had a guy who originally slept on the bunk, but beneath me, he was 65 years old, and he had 8 teeth pulled over the course of like 11 years in prison because they just would give you aspirin until the pain got so bad, then they would remove it because they weren't going to do care. I thought that was so harmful, for somebody like that, because it's disfiguring. So you're coming out almost like a different person, and just sort of, I know you've written about this. And you've had your own experience. Talk about that.
Yeah. So, the dental care I found, I was surprised when I got out and started learning about what it was like in other places, because I did my time in New York State prisons, which, the dental care is not great, but they do it most of the time. Like, there is some amount of dental care available. There was not, of course, in the county jail. I was in the county jail for like 10 or 11 months. There's one guy that was there for like 2.5 years, and that's pretty common in county jails to just not offer any dental care, because the idea is that it's short term. So, sort of even in the states that do it well, the county jails are still, you're not getting any dental care. And then you go to prison, and, in some states, it's just really appalling. Like in Texas, if you had bad teeth, they would let them go till you pulled them. They do some fillings. I got data on how many fillings they do per year. It is fewer than you would think would be expected with the population the size of the Texas prison population.
Yeah, right.
But they do them sometimes. But the issue is more when they let it go, or when you need to get teeth pulled, and they'll tell you that, oh, well, if you just get them all pulled, then we'll give you dentures. And then they don't. And there's a bunch of toothless guys, or nearly toothless guys. And instead of giving them dentures, they would put all their food in a blender, blend it up, and serve it to them that way. Sometimes all mixed together in one cup, sometimes in just mushed in the different parts of the tray. And this was not some like hidden practice. This was literally in their policies. Like I thought for sure when I was trying to report this, I was like, this is going to be so hard to prove. Like, how am I going to prove they're serving them pureed mess hall food instead of giving them teeth? But no, it was in the policies. And so after I wrote that story, then Texas, said they would start giving people dentures. They bought 3D printers to 3D print dentures, which is much cheaper, and they're much easier to replace that way, but then the pandemic happened, and they still, the need was so great before the pandemic that I think they did something like 500-ish, or they were on track to have done like 500 by the end of 2019 in that year, versus having done 50 or fewer each year before that. So it's a huge increase. But given that it's a prison population that was at that time around 145,000 guys and girls, and 15% of them are over 55. Like, given those demographics, like, you can guess that 500 dentures is significantly below the actual needs at that point. But regardless, then the pandemic hit. They really didn't do any sort of dental care. I haven't heard any reports of them starting up on dental care. But, you know, there was sort of a step forward and then pause. Yeah. And then there's some states that do a thing, I think Nebraska and Michigan, and maybe some other states as well, that do a thing where there's a complete blackout period in the beginning where you cannot get any dental care. And then, you know, afterwards, of course, you're still getting the regular suboptimal dental care. But in the first like year in one of those states, in the first 2 years in the other one, you get zero dental care. It doesn't matter what it is, like no fillings, no cleanings, like nothing's happening for you know, however long their blackout period is, which is obviously just not good in terms of, you know, some things need to be treated sooner so they don't get worse. And both those states are being sued over that. In one case, it's part of a bigger suit, and in another case, it's just a separate suit on dental situation. So, you know, that's just the teeth part of it. Obviously, we know dental or medical care in general is not good in prisons. You know, just I'm consistently shocked by the new varieties of appalling that, you know, that you run into in doing this. A few years ago, I was shocked to learn that, you know, they don't necessarily give you a prosthetic limb if you have one leg. In Texas, if you're in ADSEG or death row, so you're, you know, in solitary basically all the time, they don't think you need another leg because you're in solitary. It's literally in their policy. You don't, you know, they won't give you a prosthetic. And, you know, I've also, I wrote one story about a guy that had sued over like a staph infection. And, you know, you read a lot of those kinds of lawsuits, but in this case, he had been released during it. So he had a picture of how bad they'd let his arm get. I mean, it looked like a zombie arm, you know. I mean, it looks like sort of the worst case scenarios that you see when you Google MRSA infection. And, you know, and this is just a run-of-the-mill case. That's not a class action suit. That's just, you know, things that happen in prison. This is within the realm of norm. It's not even beyond the pale. It should be, but it's not.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, there's one thing to me that's related to teeth is also food, because you were saying they blend the food together, and I think for most people who've been in prison, the things you want to make sure you get food. You don't want to be hungry, and that has all of these other ramifications, not just health, but just mood and the rest. And you want to get sleep. But in terms of food, we've heard more complaints in the last year, mostly because of COVID, I think, about food. And I think part of that's because corrections officers have been out sick, so they've been the facilities have been short-staffed. People are getting sometimes 2 meals. They're getting, you know, no more hot meals. It's just sandwiches or just bread or an onion or something. Mm-hmm. I mean, what are you hearing on that, and how do you think that affects life inside prison?
Well, so I think that the food has gotten worse, partly because of understaffing, partly because some of these places have been locked down for so much of the last year that they were getting, you know, bagged meals and things, and they weren't getting to go to the mess halls. So I think it's been the longest, sort of most sustained period of abysmal food that we've probably seen ever, you know? Yeah. I think a lot of times people are used to getting really bad bagged meals for a discrete period of time, like, you know, 2 weeks of a lockdown, or someone escaped and, you know, everyone's locked in for a couple of weeks, or, you know, in New York when you were on the draft, you know, when you were getting transferred, you would get, you know, pretty, you know, piss poor bagged meals. But this is the longest that in some states that they've done this, like, for months on end. So in Texas, people have been surviving on food that doesn't look edible, often isn't identifiable, and doesn't look like it's enough calories. Yeah. You know, I I've been getting more pictures of it too, right? And
Mhm.
tweeted out at one point a picture of somebody had been given like, it was like a tortilla, a hot dog, no bun. It was just like a tortilla with a hot dog sitting on top, a cup of like some unidentifiable mush, and a whole raw uncooked potato. And like that was dinner. And that was a particularly abysmal one, but the better looking meals were not necessarily better. Varies by unit, and of course, some units are doing better at it than others. But to me, that both like demonstrates what happens when you're understaffed and you're locking people down and you're putting them on these sacked meals. And also, I think part of the reason that we are able to see or be aware of the fact that the food has been so bad is because the lockdowns and COVID, I think, has made more people able to get cell phones or keep cell phones. If the guards aren't searching at each other as much when they come into the units, they're able to smuggle in more phones. If they're not doing cell searches because they don't want to get COVID, then guys that have phones are able to hold on to them longer. And I also think that the pandemic made people desperate and made them more willing to reach out to, reporters, advocates, outside supporters, and, show us actual documentation of what's going on inside.
Yeah. Jessica, I want to bring you back to talk. This may be a little bit outside your lane, and if it is, you don't have to address this, but Amit was here to talk about temperature control. And we saw when in Manhattan a couple of years ago, they lost heat there, and the people inside were banging on the windows and calling for help. And that was something. And, it was obviously terrible and they were denying it, but it was, the system broke. But then we have a lot of states in this country that don't even try to temperature control because they're southern states, and during the summer, they just don't have air conditioning. And people are boiling. And I guess on all of these issues, the pushback you get is, well, if you don't like those conditions, you shouldn't have gone to prison or put yourself in a position to go to prison. I mean, how do you deal with that when it comes to things like, that this isn't whining? This isn't people expecting to be at Club Fed or the Ritz or have, some nice country club stay. There's a line here that makes it, if not torture, so bad that's, it's creating dangerous conditions. It's not getting these people in a position to come home and, be social. So like, can you talk about how do you address that? Like when people just say, oh, well, then they shouldn't have done something wrong, or they, they deserve it, whatever comes to them because they're in prison.
Yeah, I think, Kevin, people are being deprived of their liberty. That's the punishment. It's not that it's, I think in the case of solitary confinement, it's like we've built a prison within a prison. And I think the conditions issues that exist in prisons exacerbate the issues. And so it from everything, it's like the MRSA piece, right? The health, the wellness of people. It's really hard to maintain any kind of those types of what we would say a regular environment when everybody's being deprived of things like food and, healthy, clean air and water. So I think that those conditions issues are a real problem inside prison and jails. And I think it has to be the same thing we're talking about is it has to be approached by saying like, we have to not let people be tortured when they're already being deprived of their liberty.
What do you think is
Can I jump in here? I feel like I get into this argument with people all the time on the internet. And, I think one thing is that when people see like one piece of it, they see the bad food. And I don't know that people sort of grasp the bigger picture of like, it's every piece of it. Like, it's not that you just had one bad meal. Like you were served nearly inedible food for a sustained period of time. While you were being tortured in solitary confinement, unable to talk to your family and friends, worried about, catching a disease, that you don't know if it's going to kill you. You're probably high risk. Knowing that, maybe you have a festering infection that you can't get dealt with. Maybe you've had tooth pain for months, you know, and you're in a cell that probably has rats. Maybe, you know, I had one guy that sent me a video from his cell where there's like 1,000 cockroaches crawling out of the wall. And I think it's important to sort of understand all of this together and realize that, you know, when you look at it as a package, it becomes clear that it is inhumane and it is torture. And if we saw those conditions in a dog kennel, we'd be horrified. You would charge those people and you would take the dog. If we saw them in a third world country, we'd say that is some, you know, third world country. I was about
Thank
to
you,
swear.
thank you, thank you.
You told me not to swear. Whatever. So you would be like, this is, you know, this is something I would see not in the United States, but it's here. And by any outside metric, we would consider that inhumane, and we would think that the people who espouse this are horrible, cruel people.
So what does it say
in ourselves?
So what does it say that we do it? Because we allow it, and people, I mean,
I think we have a streak of, you know, horrible cruelty in our country, clearly. Yeah. You know, I just fundamentally don't think it's a good idea for society to treat people like animals. You know, the more cage-like, I cringe when people say, like, you know, oh, you're keeping people in cages, because I feel like that is kind of reductivist, right? And a little bit dramatic. Like,
I think
it's not literally a cage, right? Like, it's bad, but like, let's not overstate or be polarizing about it, right? But I do think that, you know, the closer that our conditions approach a kennel, or, you know, the more unlivable and cage-like they become, like, you know, this is just such a sign of us willfully engaging in inhumane and cruel treatment of other people. And we need to look at ourselves. Like, the people who are saying these things are, you know, not good people.
Yeah, and I always think too, it's like the people in prison are, you know,
there's just the transparency. I think I was just saying they're opaque systems. There's no transparency at all.
Right.
And I think these systems wouldn't look this way if the media and other people had access. It just wouldn't. I think that people see, you know, I think they have this romanticized vision of what like a rec yard in a prison looks like, when in fact it is many times a cage. Like, you're getting out of your, you know, small cell to go to a small cell in a cage that might have an overlook outside or something like that, but they're typically inside. And I think that people just don't know what prison life is like, and they don't get a real sense of it because nobody can go inside. And I think the more opaque the systems are, the more torturous they are. There's just no accountability.
Yeah, and also I think that, you know, it's difficult because the only people who can really tell us are people that, you know, society has decided are not trustworthy, right? Like, when it's prisoners telling you about these conditions, people are hesitant to believe them. And I feel this, like, as a reporter, I feel like, okay, if 3 witnesses saw something on the street, I'd be like, that's enough to, you know, to write this story. But I feel like the bar is higher in prison. If it's like officer involved shooting in the free world, you know, I'd probably get 1 or, like, if I had 2 witnesses, I'd be like, this is solid, you know. 3 is even better, right? But if it's a use of force in prison, I don't think I'd write a story off of 2 witnesses. You know, I think people hold prisoners to a higher standard in terms of, like, how many it takes to consider them trustworthy. And I think that, you know, just sort of goes to show how difficult it is to, you know, make these conditions seem true and credible. And I think that cell phones have helped a lot in that respect. People have been complaining about the food for years. It wasn't until, like, this year that somebody sent me pictures. It made such a difference.
You know, and the thing about that,
but they also get retaliated against, don't they?
Right. Well, that's that. I want to ask.
I mean, if they identify them, yeah.
Because I think that is a big problem, which is, in any other sort of government system, I think you'd have this concept that's glorified of whistleblowers, which is this good idea that we want people, you know, if they work at a federal agency or a state agency, if they see something wrong, to do that. but no one believes prisoners. So they don't really have a system for getting stuff out. Also, the same thing with healthcare. If you're in the hospital or something's wrong, everyone always says you need an advocate. You need a family member, somebody to interact with nurses or do other things because you're weakened and other things. And those are all the things you're missing when you're in prison. And yet when we push for oversight, it's precisely for that reason. So family members can get information. Jessica, you probably know this. People get sent to the solitary, to the SHU, and their families don't even know. And then if they do get sent there, they can't be in touch with them. So they don't even know why they're there and things like that. And yet we don't even allow that, right? So family members are calling wardens, they're calling case managers, they're getting no responses. So it is this, it's the system. It shuts everybody out and doesn't allow any sunlight, so you know what's going on in people's names, and they use the cover of public safety. We can't let reporters walk around. We can't let volunteers onto these comments because it's dangerous. I feel like that's not true. I think it's done just to keep this stuff hidden. What do you say, though, about people who are worried about retaliation? Because we hear that all the time from family members. And to be honest with you, I understand it, but I feel like sometimes what's the potential harm that their loved one is suffering is so bad, it's worth taking the risk that you're going to be retaliated against. And other times, maybe it's not. You should check with other loved ones who've got somebody in that facility and see if you're getting exactly what's going on and try to verify that. Jessica, what do you say to when people worry about that? Because families worry about that a lot.
Yeah, I think that, we see this a lot in our survivor community and when we talk to family members. You're right. I mean, some people felt like speaking out was going to be worth going to, like you said, the SHU or solitary confinement because the conditions are so bad that it's just worth it. The cell phone usage, I think, Carrie, to your point, they're like, if I get caught with this, I'm going to go to solitary, but I'd rather the free world see this than not. And so I do think that there is a really intentional, thought process that goes into that. I've only seen it where advocate family members, their loved ones get moved around and shifted every time that they start advocating on their behalf or closed out of the process, moved from entirely different prison systems to another part of the state so that their families being retaliated against. So the retaliation is real. I don't know. I think it stops some people, but I certainly think if, people are advocating on behalf of their loved ones, they're just like, nothing's going to stop me. I'm just going to always be a pain in your neck. And so I'm going to make you and hold you accountable to this. And I think that, we see it all the time. In fact, one of our organizers in our New York HALT campaign, he was an outspoken solitary abolitionist. And, parole was basically like, we're going to shut you up and we're going to rearrest you just to show you who's boss. So we had to advocate. The New York advocates really put fight in, and the judge got him out. But it happens, and it's real.
Yeah, I think that people should also take into account that sometimes when we have family members have gotten a member of Congress or a state lawmaker to weigh in on their behalf, and then their loved one, gets a bad time from the case manager or counselor who says, "Oh, you brought this person in." Well, yeah, they may be giving you a hard time, but they don't want to screw up now. I mean, the whole point is you've got somebody watching them, and that's probably a good thing. And I get the concerns about retaliation. I think it's probably more myth than reality. I think the fear of retaliation is probably stronger than the number of times it happens, but we know it does happen. I also want to say, somebody asked the question about like, how do you change the system? To me, this is a cultural thing. It's not just bad lawmakers. It's that our fellow citizens don't think people in prison are worthy of the most basic treatment. I mean, people, when I got out of prison, they would ask me, people I didn't know, they'd ask me if I got raped in prison.
Right. Like it's a joke.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like still 2021, there's still prison rape jokes like all the time.
But look what it took. There was a big legislative effort that took many years to pass the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Like oh, great, we have decided you shouldn't be raping people in prison. And,
Right?
like, I mean,
Yeah.
it took a huge effort, finally got bipartisan support. And so it is sort of,
After 10 years.
yeah,
10 years.
but it is, but that also does point you to a path which is, you know, you have to highlight these problems and you have to convince people that we're not better off for it. Like, I mean, even if you don't have sympathy, like, you're not throwing people, like, it's not going to be a hotel just if they don't have to be in 120-degree cells during the summer, or that if you give them 3 meals that actually fill them, if you're like a 6'6" guy who needs a certain amount of calories, like, that's not some great benefit. There's just a baseline of standards we should have, but there is some otherizing that goes on. And so one thing FAMM did was we did this visit a prison campaign where we try to challenge state and local lawmakers and federal lawmakers to go visit prisons in their districts. I mean, I think what we found was, I mean, it was effective, but mostly those who already cared went, and those who didn't, don't go. But one place where there's an opening, and I wish correctional officers unions would help more on this, is I think their interests are more allied than people would understand. And I know that there's always this us versus them between sort of prisoners and staff. But in the bigger picture, they have more in common. When I've talked to COs, they hate the inspections that happen too, where it's coming, right? Like 2 weeks from now, the region's going to visit the prison, so everybody spiffs it up and makes it look like it's something it's not. The COs don't like that either. They don't like, when prisoners don't have access to the rec yard, or they don't have access to programming. That creates a dangerous situation for them. So I just think there's more allied interest there, and the problem is administration. It's we'll cut costs to as little as possible, little as oversight, don't want to be a headache. What ideas do you guys have though for changing the system? What needs to happen? I mean, I say cultural change. We've got to sort of bring these problems to light, but there are people who just don't care. So how do we make it real, do you think?
I have a really unpopular suggestion that I think you will like, and maybe no one else. We need to fund these places better. Obviously, yes, there's abolition is one thing, closing prisons down, but now where we are in this country, for the immediate foreseeable future, there are going to be people in prison. For those people, it will take more money than what we currently spend to make them have livable conditions. For instance, you will have to allocate more money to the prison system if you want people to have teeth, if you want them to have edible food. You probably need to pay the staff a little better if you want to attract, enough staff and quality staff. And that's not true in every system. I mean, I think BOP seems to, pay better than some. New York prisons pay better than some. But, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, like, we need to put more money into the staff to attract, retain staff, to get hopefully better staff. There's major repairs that need to be done. Leaky roofs, windows that the snow comes in, lack of air conditioning. Some of the places in Texas that actually do have any kind of cooled air, they also have really terrible duct work. So even if you have air conditioning that works, it doesn't actually cool all the cells because the ducts are so old. So there's all these things that add up to creating these really terrible conditions, and it does require better funding of the existing prisons in order to fix some of them, which is such an unpopular take in the sort of abolition or reform discussion. I mean, I think these are things that can occur side by side. And if the only focus is on abolition, that happens, to the detriment of the actual currently living people now in prison. And I think, we would do well to remember that in these conversations.
Yeah, how I feel about that, which is that, when people say, we got to starve the system, that ultimately ends up meaning we're going to starve the people in prison and deny them programming and basic treatment because we don't fund it. And then in Florida, they're going and hiring 18-year-olds to be COs who have no experience, and they pay them very little. And then those are the people you wonder why there's abuse, because these people are not ready to handle those situations. So it is so short-sighted. And I am not for funding prisons and making them like Norway's or Germany's prisons and making them beautiful and keeping them at their current population. We are a decarceration group. We are trying to reduce incarceration throughout the country. But, you know, if Florida is not going to reduce its prison population, us torturing the people inside to make a point is not really helping anybody.
Exactly.
Jessica, do you have a thought on that? I mean, because that feels like it comes up. It is hard to sort of say, if you're a decarcerated group like we are and you guys are, that in some places the underfunding is hurting and contributing to these conditions.
Yeah, I love this conversation, actually. I think that, you know, shrinking the footprint helps, I think, tremendously in terms of culture change. But I do think that people should not be tortured while they're, you know, deprived of their liberties. And I think that one thing that we can be doing, and, you know, taking a little bit of what's happening in Norway, is that they are using solitary confinement. It's just not for punishment. And it's their philosophy is like building better neighbors. And so I think if you know, there was a better, like, more humane philosophy about how we treat people who are incarcerated, and how to make time, and really looking at how to change that culture. And I think there's a lot of ways to do it. I think one way is for folks working on the death penalty and long sentences and solitary confinement.
You're breaking up a little.
If we can if we can dismantle the laws, policies, and beliefs that are in place in those deep parts of the system, I think we have a really great opportunity to build a roadmap to abolition, a prison abolition. But I think that we have to do a lot of work, and we're not anywhere near dismantling that deep end of the system. And I think that could go very far in terms of culture change.
I want to ask you guys, we've been pushing for prison oversight. And again, it's not because we want to add staff to the prison system, or we want, you know, we just want better institutions and somehow that saves them. It's because we don't know what's going on inside of them, and it's hard for people on the outside to know. And even lawmakers don't conduct enough oversight or care enough to figure out what's going on. Jessica, you guys, New Jersey just passed an oversight bill. Have you seen any fruits of that yet, or anything that is worth sharing? Or is it too early?
I think it's a little early, but we are seeing not just New Jersey, but other places. In fact, I had a conversation with Molly on your staff recently about, you know, how to really provide some technical assistance to the states that we work with, because they are asking for what oversight language they could be putting in their bills around solitary. I think it's also really important to note that when you have these public health crises like this pandemic, you know, people are wondering, like, what's going on inside? Are people, you know, are they following the CDC guidelines? And without oversight, without an ombudsperson or something of that sort, or an oversight body, there's nobody to send in to find out.
Yeah. And I think
and I think it's really important that, in fact, most of them don't have an oversight body.
Yeah, I think we need to do a better job of talking about oversight. Oversight, I know, I worked on Capitol Hill, and so I have a sense of that, but I think we need to spell out for people what that means, because it, you know, I think for lay people, you know, it's not clear how that will improve things. But if you can say it allows, you know, independent investigators to go into facilities anytime they want, to check conditions, to talk confidentially to people who are, you know, in prison or working in the prison, to sort of do those things that would allow people to know what's going on inside the prisons. That's, you know, it's about accountability. And I think we have to do a better job of explaining what the benefits of that would be. Now, the truth is, and the challenge is, and Michelle Deitch, who's written a lot about this, and and promoted prison oversight is, all we'll get from this is information. You'll still be up to politicians to make changes in light of what they learn. But I think we are legislating in a vacuum, at least until we learn more about what's going on inside the prisons. I get a question. How about communities investing with social service agencies and make more of a rehabilitative and preventive system? Do you want to talk about that, Carrie?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, I think, we can make that effort. And I think, though, that it's important to understand that preventing people from going to prison on the front end isn't going to do anything to fix what's going on in prison. And it's not going to eliminate all of it, right? There's still going to be people in prison. And when we're talking about conditions, addressing that is sort of a separate issue from trying to keep people out of the system on the front end.
Yeah, and that's like a both and. It's not, we can't defund prisons and put it in prevention. We probably have to do both. Right,
and even if we defund now, like, there's still people there.
You're right, that's what I'm saying.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. You can't shortchange that. What would you say, Jessica? So we have an action, and somebody in our group can put it up, and we have a page talking about prison oversight, what's happened in some of the states that have passed it, and actions can people take. In New Jersey, was this something families asked for? I mean, how did it pass? Was it, did you have lawmakers who were interested in it? Was it just finding a champion who realized that there was a problem? Or, how can people promote oversight in their states and jurisdictions?
Yeah, in New Jersey, the woman who championed the bill was the same woman who championed our solitary bill. And so I think she just gets it, and she's a real leader. And I think she was like, yes, absolutely, these things need to exist together. Because what else was happening and continues to happen is, with the passage of the bill in New Jersey to end solitary confinement, the DOC has been real regressive and, was supposed to promulgate regulations and, have a real rollout in terms of how to come into compliance with the law. And they just haven't done that. And so they're not in compliance with the spirit of the law. And now they have this over piece that I think will help, future pieces of legislation go even farther. This over bill, I think, will be potentially a model for other places. And so we're excited to see what information they're able to gather, or walks away, what the lessons learned are there. So we're watching, and hopefully we'll have a real model that we can, share with the rest of the country.
Yeah, I would say one thing, that another piece of oversight that is always in the bills that we promote, one is this thing I talked about, which is inspections and being able to talk to people confidentially inside to learn what's going on from the investigator side. The other piece is for families to have almost, not customer service exactly, but a hotline or something where they can register complaints without the fear of retaliation. I know in Washington State they have an ombuds office, and they are able to address some of these issues. Sometimes they can then go to the corrections officers. Somebody loses their good time, somebody gets sent to the hole or something like that. They can resolve those issues instead of the family having to fight it out on their own. And I just think that's incredibly important when so many people are in the custody and care of the state, that the family members have a way to do that. And I also want to mention that somebody said, asking about the silence, and I got to say, the depressing thing to me is, if you look at Florida, which is a good example of a state that needs oversight, it's been almost 100 days since the Trump Justice Department released a report saying that there was years of rape and sexual abuse of women at Coleman Correctional Facility there. Everyone who's been there knew that. All the women who were there, and even when that story came out and we promoted it, people would reach out to us and say that was an open secret. We knew that's what was happening with the officers and the rest. And it's been 100 days. It was front page story. The Miami Herald like was into this early on. They helped break the story. We had the same thing happen at Coleman Federal Prison in Florida. Nothing. There's no, there's a bill for oversight. It's not going anywhere. Governor DeSantis hasn't addressed this at all. So there does seem to me to be a real disconnect of just, are we willing to do anything? I mean, there's campaigns about dignity for women in prison. We don't want them shackled when they give birth, or we want to make sure they have sanitary products. But we hear that women are being raped and abused regularly, and lawmakers don't respond at all. What is that disconnect? Either one of you.
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, there's always been a hesitancy to believe women, right? Especially when the women are prisoners and the abusers are prison staff, and I think that dynamic definitely is part of it. I also think it's just a matter of lawmakers not knowing what to do. Like, if you lift up that rock, like, what all are you gonna find? I feel like it might be such a rabbit hole into sort of such a, like, oh, I'm mixing too many metaphors here, such a can of worms, whatever. Like, I think, and I've seen this with some other things too, in covering prisons, where it's like legislators are concerned to a point, and then what you expose is simply just too overwhelmingly bad, and
Yeah.
they abruptly become less concerned.
Right.
And I think I think when people truly realize how bad the system is, especially in some of the places where it's like the most egregious, it's just like, oh, this isn't like broken. This is just like how it is. How do we fix that? So
Yeah, well, I think that's right. And it's like, I'm not going to take a headache over my prison population. Like, why am I going to open that can of worms and take on like we're not treating those people well? The one thing I'll say about that is, though, it really is short-sighted, because in so many of these systems, they're paying out settlements, they're fighting healthcare lawsuits, they're fighting sexual abuse lawsuits. I mean, as taxpayers, we're paying for their negligence. We're just doing it afterwards. And the point of prison oversight is preventative. It's to say, let's stop this stuff from happening, from having people watched, because watched people behave better. That's just that's how abuse happens. And that's why I don't even get mad about COs. I think corrections officers, I think this is what happens when you have bad systems. People are allowed to do bad things, and if it's not revealed, you get more bad things. And so everyone would benefit from that transparency. We got a question for you, Jessica, which is, how can a family member get information about a loved one when they're in solitary? And we get that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question.
Usually, do they
from
have
people-
email privilege or writing privilege, or like, do they lose those privileges, or what's usually the case? Do you know?
It really depends on from place to place. If they're in the BOP, they might get a phone call, maybe once a week for 15 minutes. They're probably getting some mail. It really depends on the situation that they're in and where they are. If you don't hear from the loved one that's in the inside, people start calling the facility and asking, I haven't heard. Can you give me any news? Typically, they also don't feel like they're at liberty to give much information over the phone. And so it causes a lot of anguish for people who are looking for their loved ones on the inside, or trying to figure out if they're in solitary. It is not a practice that has a lot of rules. Like, there's not rings, or it's at the discretion of the correction officer. So there isn't really a pathway in or out of solitary. And so it makes it really frustrating. I think particularly since COVID, with these lockdowns, people haven't heard from their loved ones. And if they have, they know they're suffering. And so they're like, what can we be doing right now? Like, my loved one didn't do anything, and they're all being severely punished for being potentially vectors of the virus.
Yeah, no, that's been the particularly hard to watch is the way like solitary was used for us to break, to stop scabies, and with this virus trying to keep people away from each other, using it that way. You can almost see what the prison system's doing, but they're not accounting for the mental damage they're doing to the people who they're isolating like that, and their families then who are worried to death about them.
Yeah,
we're
Kevin,
coming up on the. Okay.
I was just going to say, we released a report in June of last year talking about solitary and the use of COVID. And I think that what we saw and have been seeing is a 500% increase in the use of solitary since the pandemic, which I think is, alarming in and of itself. But I think it also has the real harm of always using solitary as the de facto public health response. And then even after, this pandemic is over, I think we're going to potentially see the rollbacks of some of our hard fought gains over the last 10 years.
What would you say to people, as I mentioned, when I was in camp, solitary was used, if people got in fights or they had a cell phone, they get caught. That was the punishment. They might be getting shipped to another facility. Do you need something like that? What would you say if two people are fighting, they're fighting on the compound or something? What do you do then to, what would you say? What's the alternative then if you're the corrections officers or the prison administration? You got to keep this person away from others. What's the alternative, would you say?
I think it's a cool down, right? It doesn't have to be punishment. You can isolate people without punishing them. Protective custody is a perfect example of that. I think every protective custody unit should mirror general population. And I don't think that there's any reason why we don't have that. It just makes all the sense in the world. We already know how to do it. We know how to isolate people. We know what medical isolation is. I think it's a lack of political will.
Yeah. Well, we're going to close here, and I want to ask Carrie this, because you're at the Marshall Project. You guys do a great job of covering what's going on in prisons, and I know you in particular have done a lot on this. Is it your sense that the media generally doesn't cover enough about what's happening in prisons? I mean, I feel that way, and I think part of it may be because of something you mentioned, which is it's hard to source, and it's hard to confirm what's going on. But I feel like then that becomes just throwing up their hands then and not doing it, instead of being more dogged about what's happening. And I don't know if news institutions or news organizations are fighting hard enough to get access into these prisons and learn more about what's going on. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but like, we can't change this. COVID was a good example of, there were always a lot of people crying for help, and people, like you said, were sharing cell phone images, or they were letting people know what was going on. And I thought the press early on made our work easier to sort of explain to lawmakers how bad things were, because people were getting information out. But normally there's nothing that gets out. So is it your sense, or am I wrong, that most media organizations don't cover prison conditions enough because we need them to do that if we're going to convince the public that it's torture? Or am I wrong? And how can we get more information out?
Well, so, I think there's a few dynamics there, right? I think that obviously, historically, media has not paid a lot of attention to people in prison. I think that sort of reflects society as a whole, which hasn't, cared a whole lot about people in prison. And I think that in terms of conditions, like, yeah, there are very few people writing about conditions. Like, even among people that cover criminal justice, it's a very narrow segment that actually covers prison conditions. And again, that is a sourcing issue. And it's not always like the sort of sourcing issue that you can just be like, oh, I'll, get more access. Like, I'll spend more time in prisons. Like, that's not actually how you're going to get the sources you need. Like, visiting prisons is important, but like, you're going to see what they want you to see on that tour, So I think it, really really sourcing well is difficult, and it's also difficult for people that didn't do time to even understand which of the ridiculous and wild and unbelievable things they're being told are really within the realm of possibility and which are just absurd. I think that's one place where it's really, you know, helped having, you know, my background, you know, having done time. I have some sense of sort of like what I might expect as a response in certain situations, or what is, you know, just not plausible and what is plausible. But I also think that part of the issue with the lack of coverage of conditions, you know, is reader responses. Like if your readers just don't care, that does make it harder to get support to write these stories. And I think also, you know, advocates, I think that, you know, I think that the lack of media coverage of conditions also sort of reflects some of what I see among advocates, because I feel like conditions are still the redheaded stepchild of like advocacy in a lot of situations. Like there's so many people that I, you know, love as sources and respect as advocates who say, you know, I draw the line at the prison door. Like it's just like this universe is too big of what I can advocate for in terms of like prisons and prisoners and criminal justice. And I have to have a cutoff point. And that cutoff point is at the prison gate. I'm trying to get people out sooner. I'm trying to get them not, you know, to go in the first place. And, you know, I can't also cover what's on the inside. And, you know, also there's just the fundamental issue that solving conditions means putting more money into prisons. So for a number of reasons, I think, you know, we see advocates less inclined to focus on them. Obviously, there are people who do, like, you know, you first and foremost, Kevin. But, you know, I think there's a lot of advocates that don't want to cover conditions. And I think some of, you know, media coverage reflects that.
Yeah. Well, we're at time. And so, I just want to thank you both. I mean, that didn't feel like an hour. We definitely could have covered more. I want to tell folks who are watching who do care about prison conditions, I mean, follow what Carrie does at Marshall Project, follow what Jessica Sandoval's doing with the, you know, solitary confinement campaign. I think that's gaining steam. It's totally tied to conditions. It's just the worst of many bad conditions in prison. Texas air conditioning advocates, meet Dominic, who couldn't join us today, but will be on in the future. They're trying to get air conditioning. Remember, the private prisons in Texas have air conditioning. It's the public prisons that don't. And, you know, if we care about that, you're going to have to pay for that. And so, you know, that's one of those things where you're going to have to invest just to make sure people aren't tortured. But overall, if you care about these issues, I know that families who have loved ones inside care a lot about these issues. This is a disconnect between affected people and advocates. Advocates are thinking big thoughts, abstract policies. And for family members, they just want to know their loved one is getting through every day. They don't come home damaged mentally, physically, and that gives them peace of mind. And so we're going to keep fighting on this. And we're going to ask for your help to push for oversight in all 50 states and at the federal level. So, you know, you can text FAMM to 21333 to join us to do that. And like I said, we have a special page on prison reform and oversight, model bills, things that you can push in your state. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks to our guests, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.